For years, Americans were told the system was strong, the markets were smart, and the people in charge knew exactly what they were doing. Wall Street spoke with certainty, regulators nodded with confidence, and the public believed them. Retirement accounts grew, home values soared, and risk was treated like a technical detail, not a threat. But beneath that calm surface, something dangerous was building, quietly and relentlessly, until the moment arrived when confidence didn't just crack. In early September 2008, the financial world was running on fear disguised as routine. Banks still opened their doors, traders still showed up in pressed suits, and news anchors still spoke in measured tones. But behind closed doors, the language had changed. Words like liquidity and exposure were no longer abstract. They were urgent. Every phone call carried the same unspoken question: who was going to fail next? At the center of the storm stood institutions that had once seemed untouchable. These were firms older than most American cities. Firms that had survived wars, depressions, and decades of political change. They had helped shape modern capitalism and were treated as permanent fixtures of the economy. Their leaders had spent years assuring investors, regulators, and the public that they understood risk better than anyone else. Now, those assurances were evaporating by the hour. The problem wasn't a single bad decision or one reckless executive. It was a system built on borrowed money and blind faith. Mortgage loans had been bundled, sold, and resold so many times that no one could say with confidence who actually owned what. Complex financial products were rated as safe, not because they truly were, but because the system depended on believing they were. Everyone trusted the math, the models, and the momentum. Very few questioned the foundation. Inside the U.S. government, alarm bells were ringing. Treasury officials and Federal Reserve leaders were staring at numbers that didn't make sense anymore. Markets weren't behaving rationally. Institutions weren't trusting each other. Overnight lending, the quiet engine that kept banks alive, was freezing up. Without it, even the strongest firms could collapse in days, not years. Lehman Brothers, a 58-year-old investment bank, was running out of time. Its balance sheet was drowning in toxic assets, and potential buyers were backing away. Government officials faced an impossible choice: intervene and set a precedent, or step back and let the market deliver its verdict. Either decision carried consequences that would ripple far beyond Wall Street. As the weekend approached, meetings stretched late into the night. Everyone understood that whatever happened next would redefine capitalism in America. The question was no longer whether the system was in danger. The question was how much of it would survive. By Friday night, the fate of global finance was being decided behind locked doors in New York. What looked like another ordinary weekend on the calendar had quietly become a countdown. Markets would open again on Monday morning, and if nothing was resolved by then, panic would spill from trading floors into the real economy. Everyone in the room understood that time. Not money was the most valuable asset left. Lehman Brothers was bleeding confidence faster than it could raise cash. Potential buyers circled, examined the books, and pulled away. The numbers were worse than expected, the assets harder to value, and the risks too politically toxic. Bobby and officials hoped a private solution would appear, something that would spare them from using taxpayer money. Across the table sat executives who had built their careers on certainty. They were used to controlling outcomes, not begging for them. Now they watched as regulators questioned assumptions that had gone unchallenged for years. The same leaders who once lectured the world about discipline and free markets were suddenly asking for extraordinary support. The contradiction hung heavy in the room, unspoken but understood by everyone present. As talks dragged on, a dangerous belief took hold. Some officials convinced themselves that letting Lehman fail might restore discipline. The system, they argued, needed a shock. Markets had grown reckless because they believed someone would always step in. If one giant was allowed to fall, fear would teach a lesson no regulation ever could. It was a gamble dressed up as principle. When the decision finally came, it arrived without drama. Then reality rushed back in. Lawyers prepared filings. Executives made final calls. An institution that had survived for more than a century was about to vanish. Early Monday morning, the news hit the world. Lehman Brothers was gone. Markets didn't pause to reflect on the symbolism. They reacted with pure instinct. Stocks plunged, credit markets seized, banks stopped trusting one another entirely. What had been a contained crisis instantly became a global one. The lesson, if there was one, was far harsher than anyone expected. Inside Washington, disbelief turned into urgency. The collapse had not stabilized the system. It had poisoned it. Firms once considered safe were suddenly suspect. Money market funds, long treated as boring and reliable, began to wobble. Ordinary Americans, far removed from trading floors, were about to feel the consequences of a decision made over a single weekend. Confidence, once lost, proved almost impossible to rebuild. And as leaders scrambled to contain the damage, a terrifying realization set in. Lehman was not the end of the crisis. It was the beginning. The fall of Lehman Brothers did what no press conference or reassurance ever could. It exposed fear. Not the distant kind felt by investors, but the immediate gut-level panic that spreads when people realize the rules have changed. By Tuesday morning, financial leaders were no longer debating theory. They were reacting to shock, and shock does not wait for permission. Balance sheets were questioned, corner parties were scrutinized, and every firm wondered whether it would be next. The invisible glue of finance had evaporated overnight. Banks hoarded cash, refusing to lend even for a single day. The system was seizing up from the inside. Inside government offices, the mood shifted from caution to alarm. Officials began to understand the scale of what they had unleashed. Maine's collapse had not drawn a clean line. It had erased all lines. If one giant could fail, then any firm could. Markets were no longer distinguishing between strong and weak. They were punishing everyone equally. The next domino loomed immediately. One of the largest insurance companies in the world was drowning in obligations tied to the same toxic financial products. Unlike Lehman, AIG was woven into every corner of the global economy. Its failure would not be symbolic. It would be catastrophic. Pension funds, banks, and governments around the world were exposed, whether they realized it or not. This time, there was no talk of principle, no lectures about moral hazard. The numbers were too large, the consequences too immediate. Officials faced a brutal truth. The system they were supposed to regulate had grown so complex that allowing it to fail was no longer an option. They had reached the moment everyone had denied would ever come. Decisions were made at breathtaking speed. When the government stepped in to rescue AIG, the message was unmistakable. Some institutions were not just too big to fail, they were too connected to ignore. The line had been crossed, and there was no way back. The free market had met its breaking point, and policy was now being written under extreme pressure. Outside Washington and Wall Street, Americans sensed something was wrong. Retirement accounts shrank, jobs became uncertain. Confidence, already shaken, continued to erode. The crisis was no longer contained within glass towers and trading desks. It was moving outward, toward everyday life. What began as a financial emergency was becoming a national reckoning, and the most dangerous phase was still ahead. As markets continued to unravel, the crisis reached a point where silence was no longer possible. Government officials had spent days making decisions in private, but now they faced a public that was confused, angry, and afraid. Trillions of dollars were vanishing from the economy, and the people responsible for explaining it had to admit a painful truth. The system had failed, and fixing it would require unprecedented intervention. Treasury leaders stepped forward with a proposal that sounded impossible. The government would ask Congress for hundreds of billions of dollars to stabilize the financial system. The money would be used to buy toxic assets, restore confidence, and prevent a total collapse. It was framed as a temporary measure, a necessary bridge back to normalcy. But to many Americans, it felt like a reward for reckless behavior. The backlash was immediate. Lawmakers' phones flooded with calls from furious voters. Families were losing homes and jobs, while the same institutions that caused the crisis were now asking for help. The idea of using taxpayer money to rescue Wall Street struck a nerve that ran deep. Trust in financial leaders was already gone. Now political trust was eroding as well. Inside Congress, the debate was brutal. Some warned that rejecting the plan would trigger economic disaster. Others argued that approving it would destroy faith in fairness and accountability. There was no option that felt just, only options that felt necessary or dangerous. Every vote carried consequences that would echo for generations. When the proposal was first put to a vote, it failed. Markets reacted instantly. Stocks plunged again, sending a clear message that uncertainty was not an abstract concept. It was measurable, and it was accelerating. Lawmakers watched as the numbers confirmed what officials had been warning all along. Doing nothing was also a decision, and it carried its own price. Under mounting pressure, the plan returned with changes, promises of oversight, and assurances of transparency. This time, it passed. The rescue package became law, marking one of the most dramatic expansions of government power in modern economic history. The free market had not been replaced, but it had been suspended to save itself. For ordinary Americans, relief did not arrive with the legislation. Fear lingered. Jobs continued to disappear. The gap between Wall Street and Main Street felt wider than ever. The rescue may have stopped the immediate bleeding, but it left behind a question no policy could easily answer. Who, exactly, had the system been built to protect? By late 2008, the financial crisis had become a story of extremes. Some firms were praised for bold action. Others were vilified for failure. The line between hero and villain blurred with every passing day. Bankers, regulators, and politicians all played parts in a drama that had no rehearsals, only consequences. Decisions once considered routine now carried the weight of the entire economy. Inside the Federal Reserve and Treasury, officials worked around the clock. They became the unseen lifeline for a system that seemed intent on unraveling. They orchestrated emergency loans, coordinated with foreign governments, and negotiated deals that sometimes seemed impossible. To the public, these were faceless figures, yet the decisions they made determined whether millions would lose their jobs, homes, or savings. Meanwhile, on Wall Street, executives struggled with their own contradictions. Many were convinced they had done everything by the book, only to watch their institutions collapse. Some acted heroically, taking personal risks to stabilize their firms. Others panicked, making short-term moves that worsened the situation. In hindsight, every choice was magnified, every misstep scrutinized. In a world built on leverage and trust, there was no room for error. How had the system grown so fragile? How had confidence in long-standing institutions evaporated so quickly? And perhaps most importantly, who would be held accountable? The answers were complicated, messy, and sometimes unsatisfying. Regulation had lagged behind innovation, greed had outpaced caution, and silence in the face of warning signs had allowed risk to accumulate unchecked. What's crisis also revealed courage in unexpected places. Ordinary employees worked tirelessly to keep banks functioning, filing reports, managing transactions, and helping anxious customers. Regulators, often criticized as bureaucratic, made agonizing decisions that prevented complete collapse. And in the halls of Congress, some members fought tirelessly to balance urgency with oversight, seeking to protect the public while navigating a system that few truly understood. Yet, even as some actors were celebrated, the emotional toll was staggering. Anxiety, stress, and fear defined daily life for millions, from traders to homeowners. Confidence, once treated as a given, became fragile. And the lesson was clear. In a world where trust is currency, silence in the face of warning signs can be as costly as recklessness. By the end of 2008, Americans understood the stakes in a way they never had before. Wall Street was not an abstract concept. It was real, and its failures could touch every corner of life. The financial system had survived, but the public's faith in it had been forever altered. As the dust of the 2008 financial crisis began to settle, the world looked very different. The immediate chaos had passed. Emergency measures had prevented total collapse, but they had also revealed the true cost of delay, silence, and misplaced confidence. Across the country, stories of personal loss and resilience multiplied. Middle-class families who had invested in homes, retirement accounts, and college funds now had to navigate a world where the rules had changed. Some were forced to adapt quickly, learning to live on less, adjust expectations, and rebuild. Others felt betrayed, questioning the fairness of a system that rewarded some and punished others. The crisis had become a social mirror, reflecting both ambition and vulnerability, greed and courage. Wall Street itself underwent transformation, though slowly and reluctantly. Firms tightened risk controls, reevaluated internal practices, and faced greater scrutiny from regulators. The culture of unchecked risk had been challenged, but old habits proved hard to break. Executive bonuses, complex derivatives, and the drive for short-term profit remained, shadowed now by a caution born of near disaster. Perhaps the most enduring lesson was for the ordinary observer. People realized that the economy, often treated as an abstract force, was deeply human. It depended on trust, judgment, and timely action. Numbers on a screen represented livelihoods, aspirations, and futures. Confidence, once lost, could not simply be restored with policy or statistics. It had to be rebuilt through transparency, accountability, and a recognition of risk that extended beyond models and assumptions. The story of 2008 was not just about banks or bailouts, it was about decisions, both heroic and flawed, and their consequences on millions of lives. It was a story of human error, resilience, and the hard-earned knowledge that no system, no matter how venerable, was immune to collapse. As Americans moved forward, the question lingered: would the lessons of 2008 guide future decisions, or would history quietly repeat itself? The answer remained uncertain, but one thing was undeniable. The crisis had changed the country, and its story would be told for generations.